Um, okay, we are live. We will give everyone a minute or two to join us here today, but we are really excited to be talking about DEIB in everything outside of hiring. There's so much to cover. We have an unbelievable group of speakers today on the panel that I'm really excited to start chatting with. And to kick things off, I'm happy to introduce myself. My name is Mitch Stein. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Pond. We host these sessions every week. Every Thursday, you'll find us here, completely free, open to the public, covering tons of topics relevant to nonprofits. Pond is a platform where nonprofit leaders connect with any and all resources they need to drive impact at their organization. So we help match people with the right tech, the right consultants, the right training, and help you pay for it. So be sure to check out joinpond.com and learn more. But we're here today to talk about diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging outside of hiring, where it gets tons of attention. And there's lots of important places outside of that function in an organization where we need to talk about it and lift it up. I'm going to ask all of our speakers to introduce themselves, who they are, what their job is, and also a few layers of their identity that are most important to them. To start off, like I said, I'm Mitch. I'm a cisgendered white male. I identify as gay. My pronouns are he, him. And I think I'm a friend. I'm a close family member. And I'm just obsessed with figuring out innovative ways to help other people. And that's what brings me into this conversation today. Tracy, do you want to go first?
Sure. Hi, everybody. Tracy Kranzak. My pronouns are they, them. I am Director of Partnerships at Bonterra, where we are putting together our platform around enabling those who do good. So it's a really exciting place to be. We are a new company, and we are a new company comprised of older companies in our space. So we've been making a splash, and it's been a lot of fun to be on that ride. Layers of identity. I haven't actually thought about this in like 30 years because I'm just like, I exist. I guess what I'd say is keeping it clean. I am queer AF. I always have been, and I probably always will be. I express that through gender fluidity. I express that through just showing up in this world. And, I've been benefit of a journey of being able to participate in some seminal moments of movement organizing in the LGBT communities and racial justice organizing in my past. And that informs a lot of my perceptions of power and privilege and how we work in this world.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Tracy. Glad to have you here. Jennifer, do you want to go next?
Sure. That was so great, Tracy. So I'll definitely try to keep it as polished. So my name is Jennifer Mckenzie. I identify as she, her. I am a mother of four. I have a 13-year-old, a 6-year-old, a 3-year-old, and a 1-year-old, which I take great pride in. I'm also a wife, and I currently serve as an executive leader of a nonprofit organization as their associate vice president of program performance and strategy. It is a very, very long title. All that means is that I'm responsible for strategic partnerships and moving our strategic plan and actions along. I really think about the work that I do around activating strategy and mobilizing teams, and that work is very important and inspiring to me. I also obviously an African-American woman, so that really is central to the work that I do here at the Columbus Urban League, because our work is centered around serving African-American individuals as well as those who are disenfranchised. And so it allows me to be authentic in ways that I don't think that I have always had the opportunity to. And it helps me to really think about why belonging is important, why inclusivity is important, but it's also given me a different lens since our organization is predominantly African-American. So I get to look at what does inclusivity and belonging look like within the context of our organization. So looking forward to the conversation today.
Amazing. Thanks so much, Jennifer. And Angelina.
Hi, I'm Angelina Bungu. I also identify as a she, her. And many hats. When you ask the question, I'm just like, where do you begin? In your identity as a person. So I Caucasian and Native American, Cherokee, Eastern tribe. and is one aspect of me, but I also have a disability that is hidden. But it is still very much a part of who I am. You just don't see it. I am in an interracial, intercultural, multilingual household with my husband, and we have, biracial children. And I am the director of resource development, the League here in Fort Wayne, Indiana. And our work is to work with people with disabilities to increase their independence, and specifically working towards a vision within the community on a lot of disability advocacy, so that we can achieve full inclusion of people with disabilities in all aspects of community life here, through accessibility, awareness, diversity and belonging, and inclusion in the workforce, all of that.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much, Angelina. Thank you, everyone. I will just say too, for the audience, please drop your questions in. This is a brave space, a safe space. We want to make sure we're hitting on the things that are relevant and real time in your lives. So don't hesitate to drop those in. For starters, I think it would be helpful as we get into this topic to just, as a foundation, define what we mean when we say diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. They are getting thrown out a lot as kind of buzzwords. But Jennifer, I don't know if you want to kick us off with how you think about defining those terms and what they mean within the context of your work.
Well, yeah, that's such a great question. And honestly, I feel like our definition of those things continue to evolve as we evolve, as the work evolves, right? And so what I might share today may be different based off of what we learn as we continue to do this work. So because we are an African-American, both led and centered organization, we tend to focus on equity, which is of course different from equality, right? So for a very long time, African-Americans have been, searching for and seeking for and fighting for, equal rights, meaning, the same. So whereas when we think about, of course, equity, it's making sure that everyone has what they need in order to succeed. And it recognizes the individuality of that. And it recognizes that some people may need a little bit more, a little bit less, but ultimately it's about the result. And so what it is that we're trying to accomplish, how do we make sure that everyone has, again, what they need? The other word that I like to really focus on is inclusivity. And so, and I feel like inclusivity for me and belonging is somewhat the same. I know it's not, but I feel like I have not quite found the line on that. But I think it's mostly around how people feel about what it is that we're doing in this space, right? So of course we have the actions, we have the employee resource groups, we have all the things that comes along with the outward manifestation of what it is that we're trying to do in this space. Whereas I feel like inclusivity and belonging is the impact that it's having on the individuals for which we're doing the work for.
Yeah, and Angelina, what do you think is maybe often forgotten or left out when we think about DEIB?
Well, I've participated in years before, and through comments, I've shared, and through my work, I believe disability is often underrepresented in that conversation. It is, I think people don't think of disability as an identity. They think of it often stereotyped as a condition, a medical problem, something that needs to be solved with a healthcare issue. But disability is very much a part of people's identity, and often, and more often than not, it is a part of the intersectionality conversation. People with disabilities represent all socioeconomic classes. They represent all gender identities and sexual orientations, and people of color, people not of color. It's the gamut. And so disability crosses across all. So most people with disability have at least one or more identities within their fold. So for me, that's why this conversation is really important, to bring that up to light.
Yeah, and we'll definitely get into some more specifics there, and especially tactics on how people can avoid overlooking those things. But I'd also love, Tracy, to hear from you. Are there some nuances to DEIB that you think are particularly relevant to the nonprofit audience in particular that we should make sure we're centering in this conversation today?
Thanks, Mitch, and apologies, everyone. I'm just getting over an actual cold for the first time in a while. So, Mitch, the thing that has been most top of mind for me, particularly today, and particularly as we are seeing where the pattern of Supreme Court rulings are going to go over the next couple of weeks, are a lot of the DEIB discussion has been focused on how an organization works internally with itself, right? How do we recruit? How do we sustain? How do we grow? How do we preserve culture? How do we do culture add? And I think where this is going to go next is, what are the negative externalities that the company that I work for either creates or enables, and whether or not that is in alignment with who I am as a person is going to be the next frontier of where this debate has to go. Because I've worked for organizations that enable heinous negative externalities, but we're fine to participate in as who I am and culturally very safe. And I think the new frontier here is really going to be asking ourselves that question of who I am may be in alignment with my coworkers and my colleagues, and I may feel very supported as a person that comes from any number of underrepresented organizations, and I might even see or organizations number of groups in my organization. See, adult thinking. But do I want to work for a company that, for example, enables gun rights? Do I want to work for a company that has accounts that take away the liberties of LGBT communities? Do I want to work for a company that sells to organizations that use marketing tools to take away voting rights? That's where things are going to go next. And that's the question and the nuance that I want to give to folks to start thinking about today.
Mitch, if I could add something to that, because I want to add, a little bit, because as a fundraiser, we're always looking for strategic partners and partnerships. And I think this is also very important, goes right along with what Tracy said, not only just working for, but who do we want those partners to be with? Are those organizations or even donors? And it's hard because, as a fundraiser, you're constantly chasing those dollars. But do you want your largest donor to be from an agency that is highly discriminatory and not practicing what your organization is preaching, or your mission, or what you're trying to accomplish, or even closes those doors to you? We've had, instances in our organization where some of our largest sponsors have run into issues in the workforce related to people with disabilities and their accommodations, where the person with a disability has reached out to us, hey, can you just help advocate for us in our workforce? And then depending on how that goes, it's kind of a touchy situation. It's like, if we're pushed too hard, could we lose this donor? But do we go ahead and push hard and risk that just to open those doors?
Yeah, I follow. Oh, go ahead, Jennifer.
No, I was gonna say, I love this conversation about alignment. So the work that I love is organization development, and some of the things that we focus on is systems. And so, Tracy, when you talk about some of the externality things, immediately my mind thought about what an open systems model is, right? So you have the community, you have the organization, you have the groups, and you have individuals. And usually things are ineffective or inefficient when there is misalignment. So when things aren't connected and coordinated. And so, to your point, I would love for organizations to really start thinking about that level of alignment. And when we're talking about equity, inclusion, belonging, a lot of times systems somewhere around the conversation is going to come up. But I think it's been really difficult for individuals and organizations to understand what comprises a system, right?
Yeah.
How do we get information and insights and across the system from the things and the individuals and the partners that we work with outside of an organization, and how does that translate internally all the way down to the individuals that are doing the work? So that's great.
Yeah, it's really, one of the things that I was schooled on very early and often was, it's not about the intent behind how things are put together, it's about the outcomes that they actually produced. And that is the foundation of structural thinking in our society. I have a personal hero on LinkedIn whom I follow. Her name is Alison Taylor. She's a professor at New York University, and I am constantly in awe of what she is saying about all of the ways that we've created, particularly over the past 5 years, for companies to be, looking like they're participating in this world, either from an environmental rights perspective or from, it's like ESG, CSR, DEIB. The more of these things that exist, the easier it is to divest intent from outcome, because they actually get in the way of understanding what those externalities look like when a company engages in this world. And I don't care if that company is Coca-Cola or a software platform or an oil drilling company, they're leveraging these things. And what we have not remembered to do is to look behind all of these things and say, where is the true outcome of this taking place? And what does that mean for me, either as a consumer of software or a consumer of product or a fundraiser?
I think you're onto something. Is that considered like piercing the corporate veil, but for something totally different? Like, that's a whole concept. I think somebody here should like write an article on that.
Right.
Go follow Alison. I love her so much. Alison, I know you're not listening to this webinar, but like, you're my like academic crush. So like, Alison Taylor, New York University. I love her, and her stuff is bitingly great.
Yeah, and what I heard from all of you too is sort of this, there's kind of a higher level of awareness that has to take place in the sector because of much purer mission alignment, right? A company, they'll have a mission and they want to do good, but they sort of have this like preoccupation, distraction with the profit generating component of what they're doing. And for a nonprofit, it's like part and parcel of achieving that mission is being really thoughtful of how you're doing it. And I think that external engagement is really important. But I'd love to think a little bit about programs and how we're constructing programs and running them through a DEIB lens, because oftentimes so much of the focus is in HR and hiring and the people function in general. And so I would love to spend some time going through these other components of an organization. And so, Angelina, I'd love to hear from you. Obviously, it's critical that your programs bring in a DEIB lens around disability, but
Right.
how do you actually enact that beyond just saying it?
Well, for one, our makeup of our employee base is about 76%, I think is what the number is now, of people with disabilities, different types of disabilities. So when we talked about diversity, it's also diversity of disability. So we have people with low vision, no vision, physical disabilities, mental, emotional. So our staff and our board are also compromising with various different disabilities and that intersectional identity. So we also have a great diverse base of people with different religions. We have, Wiccans on our staff, and we have Muslim. I mean, it's across the board. We really, and various different, sexual the whole gamut. We really we hire people based on their qualifications, that they are a person with a qualified disability is a great bonus, but whatever that additional thing is, we try to live it. And everybody really has a voice here. It's not, so we really embrace that inclusion and belonging aspect, not just that hiring on the paper. It really takes it beyond the HR room and puts it into action. And a lot of that too is very intentional, not just because it's the right thing to do, but also because the people we serve look and feel and believe like our staff. So when the people that we're serving look, feel, relate to the people who are helping them, it's that trust really increases. And it helps us also to set an example as mentors to them. So like when our work is trying to get people independence and advocate for them, they're more willing to open their hearts, their minds, and to allow us to really work in their lives. One of the things I could use as an example of this is accessibility. So when it comes to accessibility, accessible, and reasonable accommodations specifically, we ask the person, our staff member, or the person we're serving, what do you need? We don't assume, okay, they have low vision. Oh, they're going to need a text reader. Well, maybe they don't like text reader. Maybe they want the Zoom readers, for their screens. We don't want to assume that they're going to need this particular, accommodation because it looks different for everybody. Some people have different levels of independence that they've reached. And so not only, when we're serving somebody, we don't say, okay, these are the goals you need to achieve your independence. We're like, what are you trying to achieve? And I think that really translates to what inclusion and belonging could really define in the workforce. you ask, hey, what do you need? What can you do? You're giving them a voice to the conversation, and not just listening, you're hearing and putting into action what they're saying.
Yeah, I mean, I heard 2 layers there of the representation and diversity in staff builds a lot of that trust, because you can do all the asking you want, but if people don't trust you, then you're not going to get valuable feedback. And so that representation plays a part. And then, like you said, following through, build and consistently doing that over time builds trust.
Mm-hmm.
Jennifer, how have you thought about program design through this lens beyond just the hiring and people function in an organization?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you for that question. You had such a succinct way of saying something that we talk about a lot, which is, representation of diversity builds trust. And we know that to be true. We always talk about our work is centered on being culturally competent, because a lot of our staff members had to go through and overcome and achieve some of the things that our clients are trying to overcome and trying to accomplish. And so that's kind of built in, but then we try to be also very intentional about capturing voice, and making sure that the voices that we are capturing are diverse. And so one of the things that our local community did back in 2017 through MORPC. I do not remember exactly what it stands for, so I'm sorry if anyone from MORPC sees this, but it's our transportation individuals. And so they did a study and they created something called client personas. And so when I came here to the Columbus Urban League, I was like, that's what we need. We need client personas, right? So that we understand, while African Americans are not necessarily a monolith, right? Like it's a spectrum. And so how do people want to consume information? How do they want to provide information and insight, so that we are intentional on the front end and back end and being able to capture that? And so one of the things that we have committed to doing and we've started doing is community needs assessments, and doing focus groups and interviews and things of that nature, so that we can create our client personas, so that we are very clear about messaging, and very clear about how their insights can be used in the context of program design and development. And then there's a whole bunch of other structured things that some of the things I think my team loves and some of them maybe not so much. But it really is designed so that we are taking a standardized approach in how we are designing programs, so that we don't miss the opportunity to be inclusive and to include those client insights into the work.
Jennifer, I have a quick follow-up on that, if you don't mind. Do you ever, because you've laid out a lot of pieces there that I imagine are time-consuming, right? This is not easy work. Like, there's patients involved. Do you have people that push back ever? And it's like, do we really have to do that? Is this really that important? Like, how do you respond to that kind of
my goodness.
pushback?
Oh, absolutely. So, of course, I'm going to leverage back on organization development, right? One of the things that it talks about is understanding change, but also understanding resistance towards change. Okay, so stick with me for a minute. I'm going to share it's a formula for change, and it took me to go through grad school to figure it out. And I was like, okay, this is great, right? And so the formula for change is dissatisfaction times vision times first steps times sustainable systems. And those things have to be greater than R, which is resistance. And so for me, I like a good formula. I like a good spreadsheet. So if I have a formula, it helps me to, one, emotionally be able to understand where we are, to emotionally understand there's something also called the emotional cycle of change. So I also can understand where I am. I can understand where people are. And I don't necessarily get discouraged by the amount of resistance that is going to come. And resistance should be expected. It's part of change, right? But it's about how do we recognize and understand the impact that change is having on individuals, and give them an opportunity in a safe space, right, to include their voice, to include their concerns, right, and to include them on the front end. So period there. How we deal with that within our organization is just being very thoughtful about including them on the front end, where I feel like in times past, we try to come up with this great plan and then try to get their buy-in on the opposite end of it. And that never works. I mean, you spend so much time trying to convince people that this is the right thing to do, and it may not even really be the right thing to do. And so taking that time on the front end to get their input and to co-design the thing that we're trying to create, like that has almost, I don't want to say it's eliminated any resistance, right? But at the end of the day, we've given power and ownership to the people who really should have the power and the ownership. And they are on board, and they are inviting us to get on board with them to go down the path that they're trying to go. And that has been an amazing experience for us. And I've learned a lot.
Yeah, I mean, I want to jump in on this because there's two things that I think a lot about when it comes to all the points that Jennifer's making, and that are, one, these are leadership decisions at organizations. These are not wait for the employees to bring us a grievance kind of process. These are leadership decisions that are as critical to the sustenance of a business as any other kind of corporate strategy, HR, acquisition strategy, however you want to frame it. And I think that's overlooked sometimes because organizations are sort of caught in a trap of like, well, what do our employees think? And unless you actually take a leadership position that is proactive and creates a landing zone for your employee thoughts, you're never actually going to get there as a business. And I think secondarily, the thing that I also think a lot about when it comes to these things are, what is the experience of the person who is doing that work inside your organization, right? Yeah. And for a lot of us who have any kind of underrepresented identity, it's a second job. So, your responsibility as an organization leader is to recognize that these are two jobs and to say, for this other job, it is a priority for us to create a landing zone for that so that you don't have to work that many more hours a week just to feel like you have a workplace that you can feel safe in. And that's important and frequently overlooked because otherwise employee resource groups are just like, let's get together and talk. And what purpose does that solve? It doesn't solve things. It's just another place for venting to take place. And the thing that I've said time and again is if you don't think that there are networks and highly networked individuals who are leaders in the underrepresented space, who talk to each other all the time about your company, your values, and your vision, and how you're working on this, boy, you're really missing that boat because it exists everywhere. And the last thing I'll say is for white folks like myself in this country right now, it's a humbling journey. I'm learning stuff I can and can't say and do all the time. And it's not only humbling, and it's occasionally humiliating. And that's okay. Like, that's an ordinary process because what flew when I was a kid in the 70s, doesn't fly anymore. And that's the point of this evolution, is to say, hey, the assumptions we made might not have been perfect and might not have been inclusive. I used the word dumb the other day. Angelina, you'll react to that. You can't use that word anymore. No. And it's just not a good thing to do, right? And that's the journey. And it's okay. It's okay to feel humbled, and it's okay to feel humiliated. It's what you do with that next that matters. And if you say, wow, that was a humbling moment, I acknowledge that. It's all you need to do.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think a lot of what you were saying there, Tracy, pointing at people in leadership positions, that this is, on your shoulders and a responsibility there. And I think oftentimes in leadership positions, there's a hesitancy to put things out there because of what you just said. You think you need to be in a position of strength. And I mean, I post a lot on LinkedIn, and I remember saying something like, oh, I had a crazy amount of work. And as innocent as that seems, someone messaged me and was like, hey, just so you know, that might be sensitive to people with mental illness. And I was just like, thank you. Thank you for the feedback. I will edit that from, what I say in the future, because language matters, especially when you're posting a lot, or especially when you speak to a lot of people in a leadership position. So thank you for raising all those great points. It's really, 100%. Really helpful.
I will say, as a person who has they, them pronouns, how many times have I screwed up the pronouns of my tattoo artist who has also got they, them pronouns? Like, it's insipid how deep it goes. And I'm just like, wow, I totally screwed that up. That's totally on me.
Yeah, and I know we started about programs, and that traveled to a few other important areas, so I'm glad we went there. But I would love, as we talked about some examples of program designs and stuff that's done well. I don't know, and Jennifer, as you work with a lot of different organizations in your capacity, can you think of an example where you've seen this done really well, like it's been executed really well? And in a thoughtful DEIB lens into how someone sets up a new program?
Yeah, that is a good question. I think there's so many examples. So within our particular organization, we have 27 plus programs across the portfolio, so a lot. And in COVID, we added new programs, and so that was definitely interesting. So I would say that there is one program in particular that is designed to specifically focus on African American women who are small business owners or who are interested in becoming small business owners. And typically the approach is, okay, so what types of business services might they need, right? Because what makes sense is you want them to be successful business owner. And one of the things that I think the team did very well is not only acknowledging that there are some other barriers to their business success that may stem from their personal life, right? Not only acknowledging those things, but taking it a step further and designing programmatic services built within the context of what we're trying to do for them as a business owner, but understanding that they're also mom, they're also caretaker, they're also so on and so forth, and being intentional about building personal services in addition to the business services. And then also creating space and opportunity for those women to share their personal stories, to share their challenges, to share their successes in a way that shapes the programs themselves, the services themselves. And so I would say that's probably one of the biggest ones that I see, because it acknowledges in the program design the intersectionality of the people who are going through the program.
Awesome. Great example and great work, obviously. We've had some things come in the chat, and I wanted to respond to Dana that we put a recap together of this that'll be out next week, where we will definitely, I'm already envisioning a nice little graphic for the formula that Jennifer shared with us. I even marked the timestamp down because I was like, I'm going to come back to this later. That was a really helpful explanation. And then I would love to move from program specific things to thinking about just the technology. It's all around us. We are all, even though nonprofits might not think of themselves as tech organizations, everything we do is tech based these days. And there's a lot of potential footfalls or ways you can go wrong in how you set up your platform, your products. Angelina, what are some key things you think about, particularly related to the disability space, but maybe others, in accessibility and inclusion, as you think about the interfaces where you interact with your community and your teams?
Sure. Well, I will say it again because I can't say it enough, is, when it comes to accessibility and utilization of technology, just never assume what the person needs. Always ask. So if, for example, you're putting together these, if you are putting together an event that requires RSVPs, maybe one of your questions are like, hey, do you need an interpreter? Or just go ahead and provide the interpreter for sign language, for example, and always just make that a norm, like in everything, which, by the way, I would recommend if you would in the future, maybe you can include that in your seminars, always having a sign language interpreting here. But just kind of always having that available in a big public space. If you are in the process of creating new websites, think of all of the different potentials for the people that are potentially coming to your site. And, maybe you survey the people that you serve. Hey, what are you missing? What challenges are you having in engaging with us through our technology? Are you running into barriers through the internet and just accessing Wi-Fi, for example? Or, if you are not able to navigate through the pages because you have low vision issues. So say you're going through a new website design, reach out to an organization like ours. Look, through your local communities and find an organization that serves people with disabilities and maybe staffed by people with disabilities, and just have them do an assessment. Even if you're not going through a new one, you just want them to review your current one. I mean, we have companies that reach out to us all the time and say, hey, can you tell us if our website is accessible for people who can't see? And we say, sure. And we'll throw it out to 3 or 4 people on our staff who have varying different visual abilities, or, from completely blind to, just visually impaired at a different level, because they use different technologies and different ways of navigating. So I think it is important to just ask, reach out. Tracy, you mentioned how important humility is. Just be humble and say, hey, I don't know this for sure. Maybe I should ask the people that experience this, live this, know this, are the experts in this, which are usually the people who are utilizing the technology. I'll use an example of specifically related to technology. There's a local newspaper here who wanted an article recently on technology or the COVID effects on people with disability, and they just assumed that people with disabilities can't use technology, when in fact technology has really kind of boomed, and the utilization of technology from COVID, delivery services on apps. I mean, all of these things kind of boomed during COVID. So I told the journalist, I was like, well, actually, it's kind of the opposite. Technology has really helped. And the COVID pandemic has resulted in a lot of things that have helped people with disabilities do more and engage more and be more included. So it's never assume. Just, figure it out and ask the organizations or people who are utilizing those things.
I love that. I'm sorry, go ahead, Mitch. So of course, as she was talking, I was like, oh, wait, I remember something that we said that we were gonna. So we were working on a project probably earlier in the pandemic, and I found some language called that defines digital equity and digital inclusion. And so I've sent that out to, our organization and asked them to include these elements within their grant request, right? So that we can acknowledge that there is a lack of digital equity and digital inclusion within our communities. And so I'm happy to copy and paste the definitions here, but it's from digitalinclusion.org. And I love that they were really intentional. And I feel like that bridges kind of like that technology piece with the things that we're talking about now as it relates to equity and inclusion.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, what's funny is I was part of a project a couple of years ago called the Equity Guide for Nonprofit Technology through the NTEN organization. And it talks a lot about having to take a moment to assess where points of inclusion can be created. And it really runs the gamut from the software sales process to the software development process to elevating your own staff and elevating your own ability to access technology. The thing that I'll say is, for a long time, the axiom of Silicon Valley was move fast and break things. And that era is dead. It's over. It's done. Because what we're talking about today requires moving slowly and healing things. And I think that's the direction that we need to be moving in as people who are vested in technology and people who are vested in business.
And something that came up in all those examples for me too is just the fact that taking the time to solve for these things that may seem like edge cases from in tech terminology. To Angelina's point, guess what? It was amazing to have that feature when the world changed. And it's giving you durability, it's giving you flexibility, and typically when you're making something better for a marginalized audience, it's like you turn around and it's like, oh wait, this is kind of nice to have this access for myself too. You're like, oh, this is actually better for everybody. And I think that's something, to a point Jennifer was making earlier about resistance to change, that sometimes that can be just pointing out that actually we've just uncovered better ways to do things by having this intentional focus.
Yeah, there's actually, in our world, it's something called the curb effect. which is, or curb ramp effect. I can't exactly remember the term, but it is essentially, you know, there didn't used to be curb ramps, and it took a lot of activism from people in the disability community to advocate for curb ramps in communities. I mean, and here in our organization, we were very active in getting them instilled here. And while there's resistance, like, why do we need to do that? Well, guess what? Mothers wheeling around strollers have benefited. You know, everybody has benefited from curb ramps, you know, bicyclers. I mean, everybody has benefited from curb ramps. It's made life easier for everyone. Mm-hmm. So, like you said, if you are working to make something better for this community, chances are there are a lot more people that are going to benefit from that. So just keeping that open mind and not narrowing that focus of, should we invest in this one thing? Well, it's pretty risky with, you know, the resources. We don't want to necessarily invest in that because that's not our niche, or it's too small of a niche. But they're sort of being blinded by the potential for the overall picture and benefit to society. And as we've all said, you know, we're all better together, right? And it's all better when we can all belong.
Yeah, I just dropped something from the chat here. We had the definition of digital equity that was referenced a little bit ago, so just so everyone can see that. And something else that Tracy, you mentioned, I loved the visual of points of inclusion, like thinking about where you intersect with other people. And even though it might seem like a small thing, that's like, it's an opportunity to earn trust. You're building relationship. And even if that might seem like a small thing. So I'm just gonna, you know, as we have all these great examples around disabilities, you know, you may not think a huge amount of your audience are you know, have low vision or no vision, but a huge amount of your audience cares about folks that do. And when you're demonstrating that you're putting the time and effort in to be thoughtful, that has a butterfly effect, I think, in terms of audience reach.
The generative leadership kind of way of saying this would be to say that everything begins with a conversation. And as somebody whose career is in partnerships, you don't get trust unless you start dialogue. Mm-hmm. And sometimes you learn things that are unbelievably cool and surprising, and sometimes you learn things that you never would have thought of. You know, and I will say, on a deeply personal note, as somebody who's facing some hearing loss issues, you know, the biggest innovation that serves me now are those like on-screen readers that immediately start coming up, because I've already noticed that it's like the old hearing commercial where it was like, we have Thousand Island Ranch or, you know, Caesar salad dressing. And I'm like, what? You know, I need that now. And I'm afraid to talk about that always because I'm afraid of its impacts on my career. So this is a huge cycle that I feel like a lot of folks are in, because when you are an individual advocate for yourself, there's that tall poppy effect where you're like, well, how much do I stand out and how much do I want to make an issue of this versus doing my job? But when you make a leadership decision to say, we're going to slow down and think about where our liberties end and other liberties begin for the people that are engaged with our organization, it makes, you know, that entire cycle of like fear and shame and wondering go away, because then I'm just able to say, yeah, I just need a minute to read the screen.
Thank you for sharing that, Tracy. That's another great example. And, you know, we've talked a lot about programs, platforms, and there's another big swath of interaction we have with audience just around communication and marketing. And I think this is a space where people can make a lot of mistakes. And I would love to hear, Jennifer, how you all think about that DEIB lens to the language we use and the communication we put out to our various stakeholders.
Yeah, no, that's great. The amazing thing is we have a communications team, and they're so great. They are embedded in a lot of the work that we do. I know that team, they're part of the advancement team. So the advancement team does our fundraising. They also do our communications work. And then they also are heading up our DE&I working groups. So that is engaging with other partner organizations that have DE&I efforts. Sometimes they're going to have employee resource groups and things of that nature. And typically they're the African-American people that have been tasked with that work in their organization. and we've created a safe space for them to be able to come in, come and talk about their shared challenges and also their shared triumphs. And that gives us a good pool to tap into when we're thinking about messaging within our organization. So it really kind of creates this cyclical effect for us, which is absolutely great. And so I think having a team that is very aware of the work that's happening on the programmatic level, but then also aware of what's happening in the DE&I space outside of our organization, it gives them an opportunity to learn from spaces outside of our own and bring those insights back within our organization as we're thinking about messaging to our client base. And so I think that's been amazing.
And Angelina, do you all, as we already brought up some language that is, insensitive, particularly around on people with disabilities, do you all have like a protocol? I'm just trying to think for folks in the audience who are like, oh, we could probably do a better job or be more thoughtful about it. If there are some steps people could be taking to use more inclusive language in their communications externally.
I think, the biggest thing, and I'll go back to it, is just ask. Ask the organizations or people who work with that particular demographic that you're concerned about. So, if you're concerned about, like, are we doing everything that we can for people with disabilities in our community to serve them, to include them, to hire them and make them feel a part of our organization? Are we, or whatever that identity is, or that label of person, whatever it is that you're trying to reach, you just ask that community or the experts and the organizations that do. We can always give examples. Like, we created an internal brand standard for, if you will, for our internal, external communications, everything from mood, feel. But we have 2 pages of what to say, what not to say. And that changes, as you say, Tracy, you were humbled by using the word dumb, and Mitch with the word crazy. There are some people in the disability community who are, for a while there was this thing of disability and focus on the word ability, but no, like, it kind of came around like, no, disability is not a bad word. So it's constantly evolving. So what's right today may not be right tomorrow. What was right in the 70s is usually not right today, but it's constantly evolving, and as long as whoever the person is that's looking for the answers is willing just to say, hey, I don't know, let me find the answers, let me have the conversations, create the partnerships, create those, relationships and understanding with the people who do, and just stay on it.
Angelina, you're actually connecting something that I think is important to call out, and that is, it's a premise of servant leadership, that if you are a leader of the team, you are in service to your team. And this is just simply extending that idea towards what are the actual true needs of your team versus the ones that you assume they are.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think it reminds me very much of Brene Brown, right? So when we're thinking about, empathy and thinking about just being cognizant of the impact that we're having on other people. And so as you, Angelina, had, talked about some of the things that Tracy talked about in terms of the word that she used, or Mitch, the word that he used. And of course, I had to be self-reflective and say, well, what are some of the things that I might say that might be offensive? And I remember a couple of weeks ago, I made a comment about, someone said, oh, well, I didn't notice that was you. And as I went to go say, like, oh, that's because I had my homeless costume on, right? And making a joke out of the fact that, on the weekend, I may not put any makeup on, and this hair might be in the bun, and I may have on clothes that match or don't match. It just kind of like depends on what's going on with the 4 kids and the husband and all those things. And I was kind of making really light of it, and no one said anything about it, but I felt like as it was coming out of my mouth, I was like, wow, that sounds very insensitive. And I was like, I wonder if there's someone around me that is homeless and I've offended this person. And so I just think that as we continue to engage in this work, while you might have the disability group who may be sharing more about what their thoughts are in terms of what language makes sense and which language doesn't, and all these other communities, but then you have these silent communities like the homeless community that don't necessarily have a voice, and I just think this work has really then it's had that curb effect, I guess, if you will, right? Where no one's asking me to be more conscious or intentional about the words that I'm saying, but just the mere fact of it's kind of happening in the space, and really just being conscious about, wow, should I have said that? And would that have been insensitive despite someone being in earshot or not?
Right. That self-awareness, I think, is key to it all, is just being self-aware of that, you know. And I think whether someone's in earshot or not, as you mentioned, is similar, since we were talking about marketing and communications, is really when you're creating those pieces, is whether or not it may or may be seen this way or that way, you have to be cognizant of how the perception of your marketing and your communications to the public are. You know, are they going to be sensitive? Are they not going to be sensitive? And it's much better to take the safer road. You know, you don't want to go, okay, we want diversity, and all of a sudden the only people that you have on all of your brochures are 100% brown. Like, that's not representing diversity, really. If your audience, it's all of a sudden it's a token magazine, and you're just like saying, we believe in this, but you're not representing that really, but you somehow think that you are, and it's that perception completely changes.
There's also tools online that can help you. I mean, one of the earliest tools that I use, and of course I just blanked on the name, was if you're writing a job description, for example, how does the language affect the perception of the applicant regarding their qualifications for the position? And these kinds of tools were originally developed around the journey of women in technology because of the way that job applications or job descriptions were written. It was sort of the opt out before you opt into the journey kind of approach, right? And so language matters, and there's a lot of digital tools that can even just help you as an assistive tool to understand how you're framing things and the impact it may have on your intended audience.
No, I love that. And I'm pretty sure this isn't the one you were thinking about, but I'm thinking about Grammarly. And that has really changed, you know, for me, because it's really like, you know, spell check, like on steroids, because, you know, it gives you like emojis, like this is how your reader might be perceiving what you're saying. And I'm like, really? That's not what I was trying to say. And so going back and being thoughtful about how I'm messaging something is yeah, I love those tools. Great.
Yeah, and I think, you know, we just worked with a DEIB consultant at Pond where they were asking some nonprofit leaders of color about how they find resources or vendors or products and pain points they have. Almost everyone emphasized the need they want to work with vendors that are run or staffed or owned by people of color. And if their communications are just like so clearly that everyone there is white and it just rings so white in everything they say, you know, that it doesn't, I don't feel welcome, they're not going to have my business. And so there's like this, like with everything we've saying, multi-layer of like, do the right thing, be accessible to people and do that because we're good people and we want to be in community with one another. But you're also selling yourself short. You're missing out on business by not being more mindful of those things too. So there's definitely multiple layers to it. I knew this was going to go super fast, and I can't believe we only have a few minutes left. I want to make sure it's something that Tracy hit on earlier, and I just really want to spend a few minutes on it, is people in your organization being advocates for DEIB in all of these different levels, and how often that can become a burden, or people don't feel like they have the space to speak up, or they don't feel like they're going to be heard. So I would just love to get a little bit of input on where we see that done well or where we see that done, you know, less well or poorly. And Tracy, I don't know if you want to kick off. You had mentioned something about around ERGs with this topic, so I'd love for you to share a little bit more.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are two things that are true from my experience. One is having a community of people around me in the workplace where I have agency over how much I engage with them, but I know are truly people who either have my back or come from my experience is important. It's absolutely important because you have those days where you're just like, I can't believe this was the discussion I just had. But, you know, to your point on ERGs, where I start worrying about these kinds of things are if the if the space for those things to exist doesn't actually provide real input towards changing how your organization or how your business does business, then all you're doing is privatizing people's activism that can take place in a community setting and create a better context there. And I think it's really important to understand that the function of employee resource groups and these collections of employees, while that community is important, isn't just to do that. The function of these things is to tell you something about where your gaps and where your opportunities are as a business. And if you're not listening to them, you're actually conducting bad business. And I just sort of on the side Googled, workplace statistics, benefits, equality. And don't believe me. Go online and do the research and understand that when you create a real structure that listens to this, sure, you might be more slowly pursuing something in the short term, but the long term and the sustainable outcomes for your organization are many-fold better when you do. And I think that's the disconnect that I see that happens sometimes is workplaces assume that these are just communities of people when what they are actually trying to do is make you stronger as a company.
Yeah, awesome point. Jennifer, how do you think about, you're a relatively large organization, like making sure people feel empowered to bring up their concerns or ideas around DEIB?
Yeah, great question. And I really think that it's probably only been in a relatively short period of time, relatively because we're a 140-year-old organization, right? But relatively short period of time that we had to start really thinking about inclusion, because typically it's how do you have African American or people of color feel included within the majority community, whereas that's not necessarily the dynamic that we have here, right? In fact, we have the flip dynamic where we have very little numbers of people who are of the majority community, and they're within our larger context. And so we have to find spaces and opportunities for them to feel engaged and included in conversations. And so I think we've done some things. One, acknowledging, I think, was one of our biggest things that we could have done, is that, hey, we probably need to be also focusing on inclusion within our own organization, because inclusion is really about a power dynamic. And there's definitely a power dynamic no matter what organization you're in. And so I think that's probably the first thing that we've done. There are some other things that we've done as well, which is inviting them to the table early. Not creating the table and creating the space and saying, hey, come join us, give us all your good ideas about this specific thing, right? We still do that because that's still appropriate to do, but it's inviting them to the table really, really early on. And then just allowing people to vent, not try to explain away, their concerns and their frustration with the power dynamic. I think that's one of the big things that is really hard for leadership to do. It's hard even for me to do, right? So a staff member comes to me, they have a challenge, and for you to not have the answer, for you to just let them be and just share and acknowledge that, hey, we really didn't do that great, right? So acknowledging when we don't do things well and we have not necessarily listened very well, I think that goes a long way in terms of building trust, because you start to pull back those layers, and it's not just having a facade of whatever the thing that we're trying to be and share, but allowing everyone in that space to be exactly who they are, to be authentic, to be vulnerable, and to say, we don't really have all the answers, but we're committed to working together on this.
Oh, I'm so glad you raised that, like not having to have the answer or the solution. So many of us, if you're in a leadership, that's your job, right? You've got answers, right. You're answering questions all day long, and you have to remove yourself to just not try to explain something away, and it's really hard. So thank you for flagging that. Angelina, I'd love for you to have the last word here on making sure folks in the organization feel empowered on this topic.
Yeah, I think when you're talking about the DEIB space, for it, it's been kind of going on, and for a long time they didn't have the I, they didn't have the B, it was just diversity and equity, and then it's grown to the inclusion, and then the belonging, which I really like. Those are my absolute two favorite, those two ends, because that really puts into practice what the beginning was intended to be, because it started, really what started happening and still happens is those diversity hires. HR is looking at paper. They're like, what, we don't have enough people of color. We don't have enough, people from this community or that community. Let's just hire them. And then all of a sudden, or let's promote them. And then they become this face, and it creates so many problems. And that is the downfall to not doing DIB right. Is, I think tokenism is the word, right? So it becomes not doing it right. You end up having this whole complexity of internal issues within that person and within the team. It gets conflicting with your other members who may be, harboring resentment, like, hey, you know what? They really weren't doing that much work, but why did they get to be promoted? Oh, they were the diversity hire. You don't want to be that person. Nobody does. And as a team, I think the way to do it the right way is it just becomes not just a practice just to do it because it's on what's right on paper, but it becomes engraved in every aspect of the culture through the organization. And regardless of what their identity is, that culture stems from making sure that everyone's voice is included and belong, and everybody feels safe and everyone feels that they belong in that space. So as a director with a department, I do that with my entire team. The HR just doesn't look for those people on paper. She looks for the qualified candidates. And then it's my job to make sure that my entire team feels safe and included and that they belong. And when we do that across the board as an organization, it just becomes ingrained in our culture. And that's so much more important because it no longer becomes the superficial thing that's on people, no longer becomes a tagline.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Angelina, Tracy, Jennifer. We're a little over time, which I knew was going to happen. So we'll wrap it up here. Appreciate everyone for joining. The questions in the audience were great. And I learned a ton. I'm excited to share this conversation with more people, and just really appreciate all of you bringing your full selves to the chat and sharing so much insight. This has been awesome.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you.
Yes.
This is great.
And we'll see everyone back here next Thursday at noon. Pon hosts these every week. So next week we'll be talking all about community building. So a lot of overlap at the top today.
Great. Thank you.